thank you, everyone. Thank you to the conference organizers, professors, fellow presenters. Special thanks to Langston for being a great discussant and liaison, and to Nick for hosting me. So yeah, let's get right into it. So my talk today is going to be about this book. Recent book came out in 2020, won multiple awards. It's called The Dialogical Roots of Deduction, and it's basically an account of logical deduction grounded in social practices and grounded in dialogue. So Katerina Dutelnova's attempts to explain logical deduction abductively by explaining how logic works in communities. So for my presentation today, I'm going to start by summarizing the book and summarizing her prover-skeptic model, which is her idealized schema for dialogical deduction. Then I'm going to make my argument, my contribution, which is going to be an idea from the philosophy of language, agentive modality. I'm going to argue that agentive modality plays a central role in the prover-skeptic model. So let's just start by defining all these terms in the title. What is deduction? What is dialogical? So deduction is a kind of argument. There are three kinds of arguments according to Peirce: deductive, inductive, and abductive arguments. A deductive argument is one in which the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, and it's non-ampliative, meaning you don't get any more information from the conclusion. It just unpacks what was implicit in the premises. Whereas an abductive argument is an inference to the best explanation, and an inductive argument is moving from particular instances of some phenomena to a generalized law-like statement about that phenomena. So the three salient features of deduction, which Katerina attempts to describe dialogically, are truth preservation, the idea that truth is preserved from premises to the conclusion; belief bracketing, which is the idea that when you're assessing a deductive argument, you bracket your doxastic attitudes, or you don't pay heed to your own beliefs about the contents of the premises. You're simply paying attention to the form of the argument; and perspicuity, which refers to the fact that argumentative proofs need to be clear to the interlocutor. It needs to be perspicuous what moves one is making and how one is taking the conclusion to follow from those moves. And then she's also going to attempt to answer several questions in the philosophy of logic with this dialogical conception. She's going to give an account of logical consequence, which is what I'm going to focus on. But then she also gets into the normativity of logic and logical pluralism, which feel free to ask me about after. So the dialogical conception has its roots in ancient Greece and in the Platonic and Socratic traditions. Plato defined thought as a dialogue of the soul with itself. And what dialogue is a process of giving and asking for reasons. So it's multi-agential, but it can be internalized, meaning it starts out with multiple people, but once you get good at it, you can learn to do it within the dialogue of the soul with itself. And it's cooperative adversarial, meaning there's a dimension of it that's cooperative. The prover and the skeptic both want good proofs to go through, but it's adversarial in that the skeptic is going to hold the prover accountable to what they're saying. He's not going to let bad proofs go through. And then another thing I want to talk about, if I have time, is how this conception of logic that I'm going to be articulating, I think, is really the source of the rift between analytic and continental philosophy. But again, ask me about that later. I don't think I'll have time to get into that, but I'd be happy to. So let's get right into the prover-skeptic model. So like I said, this is her idealized schema for deductive practices. You have two agents, a prover and a skeptic. The prover sets out to demonstrate a proof by stating the premise or the thesis and asking the skeptic to grant the premises. The skeptic can either raise a global counterexample to the whole argument, which would reset the process or halt it entirely, or they can grant a premise, which would trigger the first inferential step. So all of these moves basically are inferences. If the skeptic assents to a premise, then he commits himself to the truth of the premise, and he gives the prover permission to move on in the argument. Sorry, I should put this on, but here's a little example of it. So then this continues until the prover and the skeptic both agree on the conclusion. The ultimate goal of the prover-skeptic model is for valid proofs to be assented to by the skeptic. This would be accomplished when a sufficient number of inferential transitions have been effected such that the skeptic would be convinced of the truth of the initial claim. So this is what I'm going to focus on. What does it mean for the skeptic to become convinced of the prover's claim? Caterina Dutelnovas gives us a great schematic framework for understanding how this would work. But I want to get into the nitty-gritty of, well, what does it mean for someone to be convinced of a proof? And what does it mean for someone to be able to prove something to someone else? So, yeah, we can skip this. So this is a question of logical consequence. Wittgenstein characterized this issue as the problem of the hardness of the logical must. It seems like when we're doing logic, we are compelled and demanded to do certain things by the light of reason. And there's an issue in Caterina Dutelnovas' account insofar as the hardness of the logical must is being explained by individual attitudes, individual conviction. So it's difficult to see how logic can be grounded in someone being persuaded of something individually. But I'm going to show how we can see that that's the case. So I'm going to get into that by using this concept of agentive modality, which I'll get into in a second. But the three conditions for persuasion to be instantiated are that the skeptic must accept the premises. He must not be in the possession of counterexamples, either global or local. And he must deem each inferential transition perspicuous. So note the use of the word must in each of these conditions. I'm going to be talking about this word, must, and what it really means in these contexts. So must is a agentive modal auxiliary. Modality in the philosophy of language is a way of speaking about things that aren't yet the case, but could be, should be, or must be. There are multiple different kinds of modalities. The main kinds that people talk about are epistemic and deontic modalities, so, or alethic or normative / deontic. So alethic or epistemic modality is like the necessary structure of the universe, or the possible structure of the universe. So if I say nothing can travel faster than light, can is the modal auxiliary functioning alethically. I'm expressing the fact that it is necessary that this is the case. Contrast that to a deontic or a normative modal. You cannot wear jeans in the gym. This isn't a law of the universe, but nevertheless, it is a modal claim, and it expresses an obligation that one has. So the two kinds of flavors of modality in the alethic instance are possibility and necessity, and deontically, commitment and obligation are those duals that stand in that relation. And then agentive modality, different from the last two. Steph Curry can make three-pointers. So the can here is again functioning as the modal auxiliary, and it's expressing an ability that Steph Curry has. So agentive modalities divide into abilities and compulsions. Agentive modals are a class of expressions that index what an agent can, cannot, and must do in the sense of their being able, unable, and compelled to do certain things. So it's about what is in the power of agents to enact and what they would come to be compelled to accept under certain circumstances. So let's return to Dutelnovas' account now that we have this picture of agentive modality in place. The three conditions are here listed, and I'm going to argue that the must occurring in these conditions is expressing agentive modality. The upshot of this will be that the modal core of logic and of deduction will be agentive rather than alethic or normative. So the first condition I'm going to argue is a compulsion modal, the second is a negated ability modal, and the third is an ability modal. So we can reformulate the first condition thus. If skeptic accepts the premises, then he cannot but accept the conclusion. So the cannot but here is an expression of compulsion modals. So Lewis and Carroll describes this sort of compulsion involved in logic in his classic article, What Achilles Said to the Tortoise. Towards the end of the article, the tortoise asks Achilles what happens if he accepts A and B and C and D a set of premises that deductively entail a conclusion Z, but refuses to accept C. Achilles replies to the tortoise as follows: then logic would force you to do it. Logic would tell you, you can't help yourself. Now that you've accepted A, B, C, and D, you must accept Z. So you've no choice, you see. Achilles' must here is the must of agentive modality in the compulsion flavor. When Achilles says to the tortoise that you must accept Z, he aims to be expressing the fact that the tortoise is compelled to accept Z, and he makes this clear by glossing what he says by saying, you can't help yourself. So the first one isn't a compulsion one. The second condition, he must not have any counterexamples, I take to be a negated ability ascription. So the ability, the relevant ability here is producing counterexamples. So as a skeptic, if somebody puts a claim forth to me, I'm immediately looking for, okay, is there a counter instance to this that would just refute this? Is this true in all instances, or is there a way that this could be false? And that's an ability I have as an agent. It's something that I could do. Those abilities are what mathematicians do. So I take it that what Caterina Duta-Novas is saying is that for the skeptic to become convinced of the proof, they must not be able to produce local or global counterexamples. So they can't have the ability to do that. Now I take this to be intimately connected to the first condition, because what it means to accept the premises is to come and see that there are no legitimate counter models. And that would be exhausting one's ability to locate them, meaning that the ability is negated. So feel free to ask about this later again, but there are different conceptions of logical consequence in the literature. The two dominant camps are model theory and proof theory. And this conception of the skeptic's ability to raise counterexamples corresponds to model theoretic concerns, while perspicuity corresponds to proof theoretic concerns. Ask me about that again later if you want to. And now moving on to the third condition, he must also deem each step in the proof to be perspicuous. Now I take this to be a standard ability ascription. Skeptic must be able to deem each step in the argument perspicuous and convincing. And this is proof theory. So proof theory is about, if you have a valid proof, it means you can show how each step operates in a transparent manner and one follows from the next. And so this dimension of the proof or skeptic model, Caterina Duta-Novas thinks, encapsulates proof theoretic concerns of logical consequence. So now that I've argued that the three conditions for skeptics being convinced of a proof are agentive modal claims, let me justify this by explaining why they must be agentive rather than deontic or alethic. So Caterina seems to say that it's a normative or deontic core to her account, which makes sense if you accept the dialogical conception. You're not going to think that logic is alethically structured in this Phrygian world above us, but you're going to think it arises out of our normative commitments to one another, which I think is correct. But I don't think that comes before our agentive capacities to prove things to one another. So I take it that the normative and deontic commitments and obligations which we take on by virtue of committing ourselves to the truth of premises and conclusions is parasitic on our more fundamental capacity to actually enact the relevant abilities in logical practice so that those abilities can be attributed to us. So I want to talk a little bit about how these ideas work and why modality is important here. And I'm going to do this with the idea of incompatibility and entailment relations. So there's this idea going back to Aristotle that Hegel picks up on a determinate negation. Something is what it is by virtue of not being other things. Everything stands in a difference relation to other phenomena, and it's those mutual incompatibilities that structure the way things are. So, in an alethic sense, to say that something is red is necessarily incompatible, assuming monochronicity, with it being blue, and it entails that it is colored. Normatively, someone calling something red is committed to calling it blue, colored, and is precluded from being entitled to calling it blue. And agentively, someone judging that something is red is compelled to judge that it is colored and is precluded from being able to judge that it is blue. So this would be what Aristotle would call a two-way capacity, something that you can't do these two things at the same time. And then thinking about deductive entailment, you could categorize deductive entailment alethically by saying that if all the premises are true, the conclusion must necessarily be true. You could do it normatively by saying that if someone is committed to the truth of the premises, they're committed to the truth of the conclusion. Or you could do it agentively and say that if someone accepts the premises of an argument, they're compelled to accept its conclusion. So I think that the normative and the agentive readings are right here about logic, but the alethic helps itself to the structure of the world, and I think logic is more so about our own dialogical practices than it is about eternal structures of the way things are, because logics change. So we bear normative and agentive modal statuses to the propositions we utter, those statuses being incompatibility and entailment relations. According to some philosophers, these statuses are what structure subjectivity. So the agentive dimension would structure subjectivity, the self, being able to do things and being compelled to see things a certain way. Deontic's modal statuses would articulate the other, how I'm committed to certain things and entitled to other things by virtue of my social commitments. And alethic modalities would respectively articulate the structure of the world. They enable me to say what the world is like. In conclusion, the three conditions taken as descriptions of agentive modals help us understand what it means for the skeptic to be convinced of a proof by the prover. It essentially means that their abilities to produce counterexamples have been exhausted, and that they've committed themselves to the truth of the premises by virtue of not being able to produce those relevant counterexamples. So this enables us to explain the first-person dimension of the prover-skeptic model, something which is excluded from Katerina Dutillnova's original account. It was explained in third-personal terms, which is great, but it doesn't allow us to understand what it means for an individual to actually feel like they've been convinced by something, which I take the compulsion modal to be able to do. And it also enables us to formalize the prover-skeptic model, because agentive modality lends itself to sophisticated semantics, the act conditional analysis, which would enable one to see the prover-skeptic model in terms of agentive modality in a way that would enable one to understand deduction in any instance as arising out of agentive capacities that people have. And I think that this could have pedagogical applications, not only philosophical applications. So if we think about logic not as some static, timeless structure above the world, but as arising out of our capacities to prove things to one another and taking on commitments by virtue of that, then I think that we can better understand how to educate people in logic. But also theoretically and philosophically, I think it's quite relevant. We just heard about the static nature of being, which I think is intimately connected to static conceptions of logic that are dominant now, because the logic you learn in formal logic, something like Frege's logic, which he thought was the one true final logic, but it's contestable, it's not. There's other viable options that have different principles, like intuitionistic logic and not paraconsistent logics. So that's the dimension of pluralism that it enables us to explain as well. There are different logics because there are different ways of getting people to see things agentively. So yeah, that's let's see. So yeah, one last thing. At each inferential stage of the prover-skeptic model, certain abilities are able to be exercised from each perspective. Certain things they're not able to do because they can't do other things, and those things that they can't do lead to them accepting the conclusion of the argument. So thank you.
Just want to say thank you, Sam. The paper was an intellectual dive into a really interesting new way of looking at formal logic and just logic in general, and how we can come to understand deduction, which is a necessary part of our lives. In this review, I wish to focus on Mr. Nasseri's substitution of agentive models for Nove's deontic models. Mr. Nasseri argues that we are better able to understand the interaction between the prover and skeptic as a dialogical interaction, since it takes place between agents. And therefore, the basis of deduction in the prover-skeptic game ought to be agentively rooted. He begins by reviewing Nove's 3 minimal game conditions, which are as follows. 1, to be convinced of the conclusion of a proof, the skeptic must accept its premises. 2, he must not be in possession of counterexamples, either global or local. And 3, he must also deem each step in the proof or argument to be individually perspicuous and convincing. Nasseri posits that the use of must in these conditions ought to be viewed as expressing an agentive modality, and it rewards the conditions to be as follows. 1, if the skeptic accepts the premises, then he cannot but accept the conclusion. 2, by emphasizing the importance of compulsory models in dialogical interaction, we can see that the skeptic must be persuaded to view the argument as valid, and that the deontic obligation is not sufficient in explaining the notion of persuasion. 2, a skeptic must not be able to produce local or global counterexamples. This is where Nasseri introduces agentive constraints, by which he claims that any counterexample raised is limited to the agent's ability to do so. Therefore, within the context of a dialogical interaction, even if a counterexample that may exist is not raised, the validity of the argument is not impaired. 3, skeptic must be able to deem each step in the proof/argument as perspicuous and convincing. In viewing the modal as agentive, we should understand that the interaction between prover and skeptic must rely on agency. Both the prover and skeptic have the power to do something that they are able to do, or something that they cannot but do. And this will culminate in the fact that at some point the skeptic will be compelled to agree with the prover by the fact that they are unable to produce a counterexample. Finally, Sam refutes Nove's assertion that the core modal heart of deduction is deontic or normative. He does so by emphasizing the deductive necessity of understanding that persuasion arises from agentive modality and its constraints, by emphasizing the rules and roles of agents in the prover-skeptic game, and concluding that the ultimate goal of the game should be the single goal of achieving deductive necessity. I do have a couple questions. First, how would an unconscious bias affect this process? I ask because, while skeptics will only raise counterarguments that they are able to or cannot but, will the skeptics then be expected to be entirely objective in their adversarial nature? And if this is necessary, how do you propose to combat the influence of such unconscious biases? And secondly, are there safeguards against fallacious arguments? As in, would an argument be seen as deductively valid, even if the skeptic was persuaded by the argument, if the prover committed the ad hominem, false dilemma, slippery slope, equivocation, all of which are difficult to detect in fast-paced dialogue? In this sense, are the arguments created by this process necessarily sound, or are they able to be critiqued and altered after the game has concluded? Thank you.
Thank you, Langston. So I think that I can answer both of the questions with one distinction, and that's going to be between capacities and exercises of them. So engaging in the prover-skeptic model requires exercises of agentive capacities. Now, Langston rightfully points out that there are contingencies involved with individuals, their psychologies, and their presuppositions, such that exercise of those capacities seem to go wrong all the time. So how can we have a conception of deduction built on these if those individuals are prone to error? But I think that we can think of this in terms of there's an infallible capacity for an agent to prove to the skeptic something deductively. And they can exercise that capacity appropriately or not. When they exercise that capacity appropriately, good proofs go through. But when they don't, when they're both not right about the matter, or there's biases involved, but they both think that they've achieved some sort of logical proof, I don't think that Nuevez is committed to saying that that is correct just because they say so. Rather, that would be a inappropriate exercise of the capacity. So to bring this out a little bit more, think about Steph Curry. Curry has a capacity to make free throws, but he doesn't make all of them. When he misses a free throw, we don't then say, well, he was never able to make one, or was he ever able to make one? Because there's a distinction between a capacity and the exercises of it. So I think that in the same way that Curry can miss free throws but still have the capacity to make free throws, to score points, so too can agents in the prover-skeptic model have biases that alter their exercise of their capacities while still retaining the fundamental capacity to prove things deductively. So that's the bias question. And then the second question is about sort of temporality and about, are these proofs set in stone when they're established? And my answer to that would be no. I think that they are dynamic and they're indexed to the actual argument. So logic, I take it, the consequence of this view is that logic does not exist independently of these interactions, of these dialogical movements. Logic is the process of going through those things as agents with the goal of necessary truth preservation, which is just a social artifact of a certain kind. So I take it that no, these proofs are liable to change over time. They're valid for the prover and the skeptic in the moment, but the laws of logic are liable to change just as that conclusion is liable to change if an agent is able to provide a counterexample or demonstrate that this is wrong. We thought that Aristotle's logic was it set in stone until Frege, Peirce, and Boole came along. And now the jury's out on the complete final logic. But I think there can't be such a logic because it arises out of our social interactions with one another and it's really pragmatic, oriented towards a practical need. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
Nick?
So, yeah, awesome presentation. I actually kind of have like almost an opposite kind of question in terms of capacity to argue. So like, starting with Steph Curry said, like, say I'm unable to make the free throw, I'm unable to make the three-pointer, I'm unable to argue or provide a counterexample, even though maybe somebody else will. I know that's like not necessarily logic in the pure sense, but like, what if you took it into the inductive realm, where say somebody who just traveled, they say Spain is a beautiful country, and I've never been to Spain, I don't really know. I'm unable to either verify it or counter it, and I was wondering if this idea of capacity still applies to the person or the skeptic who, although universally there might be a possibility for a counter argument, the skeptic doesn't have the capacity for one.
Yeah, I would say that if they don't have the capacity for it, then they can't rely on testimony or, oh, my friend told me, so I know it's true, something like that. They have to, it's a structural feature of this account that the agent themselves has to be able to produce the relevant argument. Yeah.
Because I know you mentioned like this idea of like, well, they can do this, and that's like a different mode of reasoning. But so I'm just trying to get this straight. Your argument is that the agentive modality is like that's where we have to go. That's the purest form of logic, and so anything else it's moot.
I think that it's agentive modality is what enables us to understand why logic compels us to think in certain ways. And I think that's what logic is it's a social instrument that we use in science and in everyday life, but it's not intelligible independently from our applications of it. So I don't think that the alethic dimension and the normative dimension are completely out of the picture. I think that they follow from the agentive dimension.
That's helpful.
Yeah, that was excellent. So I'm really you said normative conceptions come second, right? So was it that agentive conceptions, agentive modality come first, and normative conceptions come second? Okay. Maybe I was unclear on it. I want to challenge that and say that normative conceptions come first. I want to see what you say. So when we communicate with each other at the most fundamental, pre-theoretical level, without being consciously aware, we make inferences, right? If we have similar enough backgrounds and experiences, we understand the world in particular ways that will be similar. That you might call a normative inference, right? The way that we communicate then is informed by that. If we don't have these fundamental similarities in our views, we will struggle to communicate. That seems to me like something that comes first because it's what informs our communication, the thing that logic operates in the vehicle.
Yeah.
So could you clarify why that sort of thing comes second?
Yeah, so I agree with you that, as Sellers says, discourse is fraught with ought. There's normativity all the way down, and we share a background of beliefs that enable us to be on the same page on the majority of our beliefs, and that is very much normatively structured. But I think that, so Davidson has this idea of a body of beliefs that he thinks most of our beliefs are true, and most of our beliefs are shared, because we live in a shared world with common reference points and common normative ideas about proper inference. But an issue of Davidson's account is that it completely lacks the first personal dimension of normativity. So I agree with you that what's fundamental is this shared backdrop of cultural understanding that's normatively constructed. But I think that unless you bring in the agentive dimension, that's all going to be third personal. It's all going to be a person in this community would likely infer X because they belong in this. It wouldn't be, I think that this is the case. Because once you step into that first personal mode, then I think that you have to kind of go beyond normativity a little bit and talk about, okay, why is it that normativity is structuring my experience in this way? Well, it's because the normative commitments that structure my beliefs are intimately connected to my actions and my capacity to carry out and enact those beliefs. So I think that I think our beliefs and that shared idea, that arises out of our interaction with each other, which is agentive, I think, primarily.
Okay, yeah, let's go like that.
Thanks.
Yeah, so just a clarifying question and follow-up. Within the group skeptic model, they are only raising deductive arguments?
Yes.
Okay. In regular dialogue, in most dialogue in which you're trying to come up with an answer to solve this outside of just deductive arguments, do you see this playing a similar role with maybe an abductive? Do you see like the danger in dialogical interaction and how if it's only supposed to be purely deductive, it may be difficult for a purely deductive argument with dialogical interaction?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I think abduction and induction are tricky because you're getting new information, and we know how deduction gives us what it gives us, but induction and abduction are a little bit tricky. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. I would suspect that it would be the same thing, just because for the same reasons the other candidates don't seem to me to be plausible to have that priority, but it could also be plausible that for those accounts, putting the modal core at its heart would just not be any good. But it's a good question. It's one I have to give more thought to. But yeah, the book is only about deduction, and deduction is a very specialized and niche thing that we don't do very often. So it's a good point to raise that this isn't supposed to be universal for discourse, just deduction.
Yeah, the only reason I bring that up is because I see that with
Yeah. So Frege. So analytic philosophy starts with Frege, who developed a new quantificational logic that he took to be the universal logic, and he was a Platonist, meaning that he thought that these logical forms were eternal and existed above us. So analytic philosophers following him, they abandoned the kind of Platonism, but they retained its structural features. That logic is an eternal, unchanging structure that we tap into, and that we need to perfect our language so that it matches up to this logic, so that we can just hook onto the world directly. And then, so that becomes like, you get set theory and logic, and then everything else, aesthetics and history, just drops out of the picture, right? In contrast to that view, the Marburg school, and this goes back to the later Plato. So early Plato has the forms eternal and whatnot, the usual story. But in the Sophist, he sets the forms into motion. And the forms become caught up in the process of knowing. And he calls it the interweaving of the ideas. So the forms in the later Plato are not intelligible unless unless they're interacted with by an agent, by a knower. And so he defines being in that late work as dynamis, the power to act or to be acted upon. So that later Platonic conception becomes central to the continental philosophy's conception of logic, where logic is necessarily involved in our social interactions. It's not a timeless, unchanging structure, but it's a product of culture, and it's a product of what individual agents are practically oriented towards. So I think that on Frege's reading, logic would be entirely alethic. It's just describing the way that the world necessarily is, or possibly is. But then with the normative and then with the agentive, you start to move away from that. You start to think, well, okay, logic doesn't really have to be this timeless, eternal structure above us, but what if it arises out of our cultural practices? And that's the sort of continental perspective that I take figures from the Marburg school to represent, where it's a dialogical conception of logic, where mathematics, science, and logic, they're unified by practical ends that we set for ourselves, and they're not intelligible as describing some objective world. They're parasitic on our being in the world and capacity to move out with one another as social creatures. A lot more to say on that. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Sam. I think that will wrap everything up. If anybody has any questions, thank you for more.
Yep.
So how do we answer the analytic philosopher who says Carroll's just confusing implication and inference? That there's the implication, and then there's the question of whether we believe.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that you can't take implication apart from inference, and that something implying something else is itself an inferential kind of transition. That's possible because not because the way the world is entails certain things to follow, but because the participants have assented to certain premises, so they have to commit themselves to the relevant inferences. But yeah, that's a great question. I had to think a little bit more about that. But is that a satisfactory answer?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so now we're